I've spent part of this morning watching your event with Jordan Peterson a couple of days ago. I'm doing some events with him in London coming up. And I was fascinated by it. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about it that I might have missed. Has anyone here seen it? Well, probably quite a few people, yeah. It's an amazing conversation, I think. And
I put out a video on my Atheist Debates channel, giving most of my thoughts to it. I am still confused and more than a little irritated.
Right.
Because I know that he had conversations with Sam Harris, and the first one was awful and painful because they couldn't come to some understanding about what truth was.
Yeah.
And for me, truth is that which comports with reality. Done. Or at least that's the truth I care about. Once we start talking about, oh, well, it's true for me, or it's true in a metaphorical sense, I realize that you can inspire people and even educate them with analogies and stories and things, but I care about whether something's really true. There's a gentleman that messaged me on Twitter, and he's written a big piece about this thing that I did with Jordan because he thinks I'm just monumentally wrong about what people actually believe about the existence of God. And he's like, most people, who believe that God exists don't actually believe that God exists. And I just think that's monumentally arrogant and dismissive. How dare you? I mean, there are probably people who have a metaphorical view of God that's fine for them, or that they believe in, but I know what I grew up with. I know what's popular and evangelical and fundamentalist. If you go up to them and say, you don't actually believe that there's a God, you'll find out fairly quickly that they are at least willing to defend the idea that they do.
They might even thump you for Jesus.
They might, yeah. Punch me in my fat face for Jesus. That was one of my favorite threats. But when I look back at the discussion, there were things that I loved about it in the sense that we were, it's frustrating to me that I can sometimes have conversations with people I disagree with much more easily than I can with, for example, some of my friends on the left who've decided that because I'm not willing to punch people for saying things that are awful, that I'm a Nazi sympathizer and will go out of their way to say this.
Right.
So it's frustrating because I disagree with, I don't think Jordan values skepticism. He kind of scoffed at it under his breath. And I wish I would have addressed that more. I think that's the biggest regret from the conversation that I have. But I was happy with that we didn't spend a whole bunch of time talking about truth, except that it concerns me that with the fuzziness of how he talks about it, that maybe every single objection I had can be dismissed by saying, well, he didn't mean that true in reality. When he says, you can't quit smoking without a mystical experience, that atheists would actually be murderers.
The reference to crime and punishment.
Yes.
I thought that was very interesting,
I'm still not convinced of what he believes about the reality that we, as far as I can tell, share. But to say that Soviet Russia was a secular humanist...
I could see that was a bit that really got on your tits.
It did. Because you can say it's atheist, and I'll agree all day long. And it was all, you could also say that it was, you could try to make an argument that it was because of atheism, but you can't really get anywhere from atheism to, therefore, we should kill people and have this particular... You might as well start with his mustache and say, mustachioed dictators are awful.
Yeah, I thought it was fascinating, and it was really interesting, the points at which you really were clearly at loggerheads. One was that issue. A thought occurred to me, though, that Jordan clearly has a pretty bleak, you might say, realistic view of human nature and what it does when it's unleashed. And I share some of that. But it's possible that was one of the things that was playing out underneath that claim of his, which is... You sometimes see this, by the way, among very conservative people, that they come to quite rigid feelings about things because they actually themselves intuit where they might go unleashed. And that seemed to me to be sort of abundantly there in what he was saying. And I find his attitude towards religion fascinating. He reminds me of the philosopher Roger Scruton a bit, because Scruton... I think he's written a lot about religion, but I think that if you really dug down and you said to him, for instance, do you believe in the physical resurrection? He would want to not answer that question.
And that's what
I
George
think
does.
that's where Jordan is as well. And I'm not putting any views onto him that I think are dishonest, but I think that he has a real fear of saying something which he thinks would cause damage in a way if he did it.
Well, that's the one question that I asked him that I had prepared ahead of time based on what I knew, and that was, what is it that you fear we will lose if people give up a belief in a God? And he started with, well, we'll lose the narrative, the metaphorical substrate of the narrative, blah, blah, blah. But that doesn't tell me anything, because it doesn't tell me what of the narrative is of value that we're losing.
Right.
And then when I pressed on that, he just said art, as if there's not... Well, the problem is that I could say there's tons of art from atheists, except that he also doesn't seem to think there are any atheists.
Right.
He thinks everyone is religious and that people are just professing atheism, but they've made... None of this meshes with... Certainly it reminds me when I'm in debates with Christian apologists and they say, oh, you're not really an atheist, you actually are just publicly denying that you exist, you believe in a God. Or you actually know that a God exists. And that comes from, I did a debate with Seitzen Bruggencate, who's a presuppositionalist, and that's his big thing. We all know that God exists, including you. You're just lying or whatever. And he's mocked for it. And yet in reality, Jordan did exactly the same thing, essentially saying, all you atheists are professing atheists, that a real atheist would be a cold-blooded killer who would rationalize and justify this way. You can't have a moral foundation that is secular. And he tried to use AI. Anyway, I don't want to go through the whole evening, but it was essentially the same thing I get from unschooled, uneducated apologists on behalf of a much more strict view of religion. And that's why earlier, you may be right about what he's afraid of. And I tried to get to what he's afraid of. But when you were talking about suggesting that we may have lost something and encouraging people to go back to church for that, I didn't know how similar those things were. I think there's a difference.
I'm slightly towards his direction. Some of that. I don't want to belabor this, but just one example. A little while ago, after a talk, a young man, a student, came over to ask a question afterwards, and he said, this was a real warning flash, you'll know this. He said, I don't understand why you don't talk about IQ differentials.
Because you're Douglas Murray and not Charles Murray?
Yes, exactly. And there's no relation. But he said, I don't understand why you don't talk about IQ differentials. An interesting subject that it might be. It's not a specialism of mine, and so on. But it's also something more than that. And you often find this in conversations with people. You unearth something you thought or were worried about, which you just hadn't found the right way of addressing. And I was sort of trying to dodge this young guy, because to me it's a little bit like somebody coming over to me and saying, why don't you ever talk about the Jews? You sort of moving swiftly on, but this young man who said this to me, I was sort of struck, because he kept pushing at this, and I realized that I had a number of reasons for wanting to dodge this, and not just it wasn't my specialism, but I ended up saying to him that, look, you may want to keep delving into that and so on, but I said, first of all, I'm just not sure what you can do about that. And secondly, I said to him, I finally realized what it was. I said, I just would feel nervous about a future in which people were really interested in IQ difference, and where we lost a sense of, in a religious or atheistic sense, the sanctity of the individual. And it clarified for me that sometimes you see how a pile-up can happen, and you didn't realize that was why you didn't want anything to do with it. But that was the case with this young man, I'm sure.
There's people who press on a number of issues. I'm exactly with you. One of the reasons that I'm advocating so much in in this year and more than the past. I'm an atheist, but I'm also a secular humanist, and I also value human life and human dignity. And as somebody who was given IQ tests as a kid and had specific things done to me as a result of those scores, I know people with IQs higher than mine who are boneheadedly stupid, and people who have incredibly low IQs who are brilliant at things. And I care more about what people believe, because the beliefs inform the actions, and mostly I care about whether or not those beliefs are reasonable. Because I want to make sure that, I've said I want to believe as many true things, as few false things as possible. That's me cribbing Hume in a more hip fashion. But it's true, and you have to have both parts of that. And it seems to me that anytime we start trying to quantify the value of people, doing math with souls, doing the collateral damage math, doing the what's your IQ, how many Twitter followers do you have, all of these things distract from whether or not what this person has said is reasonable and accurate.
And you always get to that position that any avid reader will always be confronted by at some point, which is that somebody who's never read a book can be the loveliest person you know.